Today, we're going to go over the video that the Wall Street Journal posted about Trump's immigration plan and the potential costs.
$315 billion. That's one staggering cost estimate for Donald Trump's signature campaign promise.
The largest domestic deportation operation in American history.
More conservative estimates are still enormous. One group puts it at $162 billion. That's more than the government spent on most federal agencies in fiscal year 2024. We'll explain why an operation of this scale could require hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of a decade.
Is it your plan to deport everyone who is here illegally over the next 4 years?
Well, I think you have to do it, and it's a very tough thing to do.
That means roughly 13 million immigrants who entered the country illegally are at risk of deportation, about 4% of the U.S. population. To put that into perspective, the entire U.S. prison and jail population in 2022 was around 1.9 million people.
Scale is difficult for the government to carry out.
Aaron Reichlin-Melnick is a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council, a liberal immigration group.
Trump would have to do more than quadruple current ICE removals of people arrested in the interior just to hit the levels that we've seen previously.
So, if you look at the chart, off to the left are the Obama numbers, of course. Obama still holds the title for deporter in chief, the most, illegals removed from the United States in history. Liberals, Democrats, they love to forget to mention that part. Um, but here we are.
Under Obama.
I think that you take a sequential approach to it. You start with what's achievable. Let's start with 1 million.
The details of the plan are still being worked out, but let's say Trump does decide to deport 1 million people a year. That could still cost about $88 billion annually and take 11 years, according to one estimate. And that's assuming 20% of people would leave on their own.
Yes, it's expensive, but the trade-offs, I think, are well worth it.
Ron Vitello led the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency known as ICE for a year in Trump's first term.
Right now, the government is underfunded for its ability to detain people. To be able to accomplish this and the border mission simultaneously will require a reallocation, if not an infusion for resources.
Other immigration experts say the actual cost of Trump's mass deportation plan will be much lower than the American Immigration Council's estimate of $315 billion.
A more robust.
I mean, honestly, you have to factor in waste, um, the government's inability to audit and spend responsibly. Plus, there's like the whole kickback scheme, um, pay to play. Um, so, you could probably expect that to be, you know, maybe 500, $600 billion by the time it's said and done. Um, so who knows?
Enforcement, like the administration is contemplating, may create significant economies of scale.
Stephen Camarata is the director of research at the Center for Immigration Studies, a group favoring immigration restrictions that helped staff Trump's first term.
Once you start doing it and you get an infrastructure in place, then it might be a lot cheaper.
Deportation starts with arrest.
There'll be targeted arrest. We'll know who we're going to arrest, where we're most likely to find them based on numerous investigative processes.
We're starting with the criminals, and we got to do it. And then we're starting with others.
Trump says dreamers, or people who entered the U.S. illegally as children, might be an exception. To make arrests, ICE offers.
So, of course, anybody who knows, Obama passed DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is really for anybody who is a child and their parents brought them here to, illegally. So it was only an executive order. Of course, it doesn't have any. I guess how can you put it? It doesn't have any teeth, but um, it's something that he passed during his administration. There really isn't too much of a pathway to citizenship. When you're going to Congress, of course, anybody who knows the Congress has the power of the purse. You would need a large majority of support in the House. You need about 60 votes, assuming that the Democrats, do use the filibuster. I do know that DACA and possibly DAPA, which is the deferred action for the parents, um, that could be one big hiccup. Now, of course, you kind of fakely seen Kamala, wanting to be a border czar. So maybe since now that Trump won, there's going to be a lot less Democrats supporting. Um, but in order to get the 60 votes, I would suspect that the Democrats would want to have some kind of pathway to citizenship for DACA and possibly DACA in order to give out this kind of funding because Congress, of course, has the power of the purse. So, Donald Trump is very limited into what he can do through executive order. He has a smaller budget. So, in order to kind of, you know, be able to fund Border Patrol and, be able to afford, these detention facilities, the judges, and, the preliminary processes before or after, before deportation, if somebody is eligible for deportation, then he would have to obviously go to Congress for this kind of funding, including the wall, if he decides to continue to fund and build the wall.
Officers would either identify someone who's already in a jail or prison or go to a person's home.
Police, come to the door. The majority of undocumented immigrants are not in law enforcement custody. Most of them have never committed any offenses.
Arresting people out in the community, known as at-large arrests, isn't a common tactic for ICE. Vitello says it's more logistically complicated and more expensive, but it's at the center of the Trump administration's plan.
I'm not concerned that they won't be able to find them. It's just a matter of time, given the circumstances, given the availability of information, and given the resources in play.
At-large arrests often require multiple federal agents and take several days because ICE officers don't generally have warrants.
Immigration violations are not criminal, which means that a judicial warrant to arrest them would not have probable cause. They might have to wait hours for the person to leave their house. They might have to stake out a work site.
To carry out arrests at this scale, the American Immigration Council estimates ICE would need to hire over 30,000 new law enforcement agents and staff, making it the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. Vitello says this number is overstated, and that state and local law enforcement could be directed via task forces to help with at-large arrests, something they already do.
Having that referral system, having state.
So, of course, a lot of the major Democratic cities, because of the high influx of migrants or kind of being bused to these cities or, being bused to other cities and eventually making their way to other major cities. Um, if this, if many of these cities keep the sanctuary city um, kind of thing going or sanctuary town, it could be a problem for the simple fact that many of them may not report to ICE, who they have in custody.
Locals help ICE officers do their job. Better to have it than not, but not definitive in whether they do the work or not.
Then there's detention, the most expensive part of the whole process. It costs around $200 a day to hold someone in ICE custody. Congress has provided enough funding for at least 41,500 detention beds in fiscal year 2025. But that's not nearly enough to detain 1 million people a year. According to the American Immigration Council, ICE would need to construct 216 soft-sided facilities every year for 11 years. Soft-sided facilities are temporary tent-like structures that have typically been used near the border. Anyone not physically detained would be placed on electronic surveillance, which costs approximately $4 per person per day. Private contractors involved in every stage of the detention process could drive up prices even more.
And that's one of the big things when you look at any time that the federal or state government has shifted any kind of responsibility to private contractors. Um, it's a lot of waste. A lot of people are getting paid, millions of dollars. Just speaking, whenever I was in social work, there was a LME, which is kind of like the middleman between Medicaid and the agency that I worked for. That local LME, millions of dollars were misplaced. There were high end vacations taken, high end purchases of like cars, and not including the administrative fees. Excuse me. as y'all know, I now drive trucks, so truck was going by. But a lot of these administrative fees are in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions, and that's not including many of the actual workers that work directly with clients in Medicaid. So just imagine the kind of astronomical numbers that would be, you know, for the federal government to spend on, detention facilities or anything, whether it's, maybe they have outside food, outside clothing, outside transportation, outside security. A lot of these numbers can end up just astronomical. As you can tell, California now, it is using outside contractors for the homeless population. Billions of dollars are being, just recklessly spent. A lot of that stuff is actually not going to help the homeless or to house the homeless or to, get them jobs, employment, things like that. So even when you look at defense spending, you're talking about billions of dollars being wasted. Um, so
Contractors drive people in between ICE detention centers or drive the vans after somebody's arrested.
Detaining children would also make this process more expensive.
I don't want to be breaking up families, so the only way you don't break up the family is you keep them together and you have to send them all back.
Family detention is the most expensive kind of detention because the US government is required to give people minimum standards, and those children need to have child welfare professionals on site, they need to have pediatricians on site, there needs to be a provision for them to get schooling if they are going to be held for months or potentially years at a time.
Vitello says one way the government could reduce costs is by repurposing existing detention centers like Guantanamo Bay.
A third country like a Panama, potentially Mexico.
but think about the cost in that, right? So Guantanamo Bay, you now have to figure out a place where you're hiding these so-called, Afghanis, Iraqis, Middle Easterners, that may or may not have participated allegedly in the war on terror. So then you now have to literally fly all these people to Guantanamo Bay. They're no longer going to have any kind of human rights. So there's going to be multiple allegations. Other, with them being citizens of other countries, those other countries can now, potentially, you know, get their embassy involved with the United States Embassy. You see a lot of the, shadiness that was going on in Guantanamo. So, it's just pretty much what I'm trying to get at is this is about to could be potentially a big, clusterfuck.
Could agree to hold third country nationals so that their due process could be adjudicated, thereby lowering the costs and kind of sending a message down the pipeline that people are not going to be released into the United States to await those adjudications. That alone will reduce the number of individuals trying to cross the border illegally.
Camerata says there are over 1 million immigrants who could be detained at a much lower cost.
There are people with a final order of removal that we just never made leave. Those individuals shouldn't have to be held long. We can get them out very quickly.
After detention comes legal processing, which immigration law experts say is the biggest bottleneck in the mass deportation process. An additional 10.6 million cases would require nearly 2,000 more immigration judges and over 1,100 more courtrooms.
There is not only a cost in the immigration court side, but there's also a cost in the ICE side in getting these new prosecutors online. You need support staff for the judges, judicial law clerks, secretaries.
Staffing on both sides leads each case to cost over $2,500. To set up new courtrooms quickly, the government would likely construct tent courts, like those built in 2019 to implement the migrant protection protocols. This was when immigrants living in the U.S. illegally were returned to Mexico to wait for the duration of their court proceedings. They went to tent courts near the border to virtually appear in front of judges.
You could do those hearings much faster, logistically get more judges and more hearings heard in a day.
As with finding new efficiencies in the detention space, that is another thing that has its limits.
Tent-style courtrooms in Laredo, Texas, cost about $16 million to build and $143 million annually to operate. Once a person receives a final removal order, they have to either report for deportation at a later date or wait in detention until then.
At that point, the US government has to actually arrange the removal. That would involve putting them on a bus and sending them to Mexico, but if they're from any other country other than Canada, that means putting them on a plane and flying them to their ultimate destination.
An operation of this scale could require over 6,000 removal flights per year. For comparison, ICE had around 1,200 removal flights in fiscal year 2023. The average ICE removal flight costs about $17,000 per hour. This number could go up if private contractors who provide ICE with planes and pilots raise their prices.
But there are other assets, right? ICE has a number of its own aircraft that are already in service today. The Justice Department, the Marshal Service, has their own transportation aircraft. The scale-up need could come from the military.
Trump told NBC News,
I mean, when you really think of like $17,000, it's crazy. Yeah.
in November that there is no price tag for his plan. Camerata says the cost will likely be spread out over several years because it would be impractical to deport even 1 million people a year, let alone all 13 million in a single one-time operation.
In this case, it's probably hyperbole. What I think he's trying to do is tell everyone, when I take over, the immigration law is going to be back in business. And I think it's going to have a big effect, and then it's going to be up to the public to judge whether he kept his word.
But getting enough funding from Congress will be crucial for an operation of this magnitude. Senate Republicans have said that passing a border funding bill will be the top priority next year.
Border security, more bed spaces so you don't have to release people.
I just want to say unequivocally, fuck this nigga right here. Lindsey Graham, bro, South Carolina, find somebody else. This is probably top 5 most trash Republican senator. Get rid of this motherfucker.
People that shouldn't be released, and more ICE agents to deport people who represent a threat to our country and shouldn't be here to begin with.
Republicans control both chambers of Congress next term, but it's a narrow majority, making spending on this scale no guarantee.
To my Democratic friends, I think if you resist rational deportation policy, you do so at your own peril.